Hi folks, today we're going to be discussing chapter 20, the protist. For your studying for the exam, I would highly recommend that you guys make a chart for each of the protists, and in that chart put the most important details about them, including what makes them different from others. These are your learning objectives, which we'll discuss at the very end of this lecture. So have you guys heard about harmful algal blooms or algae blooms? You usually hear them as like red tide, or you'll hear warnings about eating oysters or seafood. And that's because aquatic produce includes single-celled and multicellular autotrophs and heterotrophs. And you should remember from Biology 105 that autotrophs make their own food, so that would include plants, and heterotroph need to eat something. What happens is in an algae bloom, it's a population explosion of aquatic protists or another aquatic microorganism. And what they do is they release toxins that can harm wildlife and endanger human health. And if you're wondering, like, why would an organism release toxins? Remember, it's survival of the fittest. So these protists are releasing toxins into the oceans to kill off any competition so that they can take over the resources. So what exactly is a protist? Well, the protists are kind of like the odd men out in eukaryotes. So they are a eukaryote. They're not a bacteria, they're not a virus, and they're not an archaea. They are a eukaryote, but they're not a fungus, they're not a plant, and they're not an animal. They're kind of like their own thing. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So an algae bloom is a population explosion of tiny aquatic producers. And I'm sure we're all very familiar with algae blooms as we've seen them in the bayous, and sometimes when you go to the beach, you'll see warnings for them. And a toxin is a chemical that is made by one organism and harms others. And there's been a lot of harmful algae blooms along the Gulf Coast in recent years. So, like I said before, protists are kind of like this weird collection of mostly single-celled eukaryotes, and they have very well organized organelles, if you remember from the previous chapter, but they don't really fit anywhere else in the eukaryote domain. Many have chloroplasts, which, if you guys remember from Biology 105, contain chlorophyll, and they evolve from photosynthetic bacteria or other protists. And protists are not a natural group, but a collection of lineages, some only distantly related to one another. So they're kind of like that ragtag gang of misfits of organisms that we just don't know where to place anywhere else. So they are a eukaryote. They're not an animal. They're not a fungus. They're not a plant. They're just their own weird mix of organisms that we just don't know where to put anywhere else in the eukaryote domain. Protists are not a single lineage, like I said before. They do not make up all the descendants of their most recent common ancestor. So think of them as a cluster of similar organisms with no one common ancestor. So key concepts. Protists include many lineages of eukaryotic organisms. Some are autotrophs, which means that they make their own food, and others are heterotrophs, which means that they have to eat others. Protists are not a clade. Some groups are more closely related to plants or to fungi and animals than other protists. An example would be an amoeba is more similar to an animal cell than a slime mold. And this is a picture of an amoeba, and this is a picture of a slime mold. So protists are single-celled eukaryotes. They are not animals, they're not plants, and they're not fungi, and they're kind of like their own strange group of organisms that we don't know where else to put into the eukaryote domain. So the first ones we're going to be talking about are flagellated protozoans. So flagellated protozoans are single cells with no cell wall. They have something called a pellicle, which is kind of like the skin of that flagellated protozoan. They belong to an entirely or mostly heterotrophic lineage with no cell wall and one or more flagella. So what does that mean? That means that flagellated protozoan have to eat other organisms, mostly bacteria, to survive. And they have a flagella, which is like this little tail right here that helps them swim forwards and backwards. And a pellicle is a layer of proteins that gives shape to many unwalled single-celled protists. It's their outer layer, or the way I think of a pellicle is kind of like the skin of the flagellated protozoan. And we have a ton of these in our bayous. These are the different types of flagellated protozoans, and what's really important to note is that these four actually cause diseases. We're going to talk about Giardia. Trichomonas vaginalis is actually a flagellated protozoan that's an STD. We're going to, Gambinase, I believe, is sleeping sickness, and Leishmania is another disease that you can't get down here, but you can get Giardia and you can get Trichomonas down here. So this is a great video that you guys should watch on Moodle, and it actually shows a flagellated protozoan moving, and it talks about their pellicle, and it shows the flagellum moving, so you can see how this guy swims. So there's two types of flagellated protozoans that you need to know about. The first one is diplomonads, and the other ones are parabosalids, and I will be asking you about these. So diplomonads and parabosalids have multiple flagella and are adapted to oxygen-poor habitats. What that means is that they can swim in multiple directions, and they don't need a lot of oxygen to survive. And instead of a mitochondria, they have organelles that can produce ATP with the lack of oxygen. So they can make ATP in the absence of oxygen. And both groups include species that infect humans. So think about it. In your body, there's lots of places that have low oxygen, like your gut and your blood, because that oxygen is going to be absorbed into your tissues and your red blood cells. So I definitely need you guys to know the diplomonads that make you sick and the parabosalids that make you sick. And we're going to discuss both in a moment. So the diplomonad that makes you sick is Giardia. So diplomonads have two or more less identical nuclei. So you see the word di, that equals 2. And again, Giardia is a flagellated protozoan, and it is a diplomonad. So if I ask you on the exam what Giardia is, you should know it's a flagellated protozoan and a diplomonad. And Giardia causes a disease called giardiasis, and it's a waterborne intestinal disease. What happens is it attaches to the intestinal wall. This little guy here will attach to your intestinal wall and suck nutrients from your intestinal cells. And it's very, very common in people who camp and drink water on their campsites. And it's very common actually at dog parks. So if your dog has bloody diarrhea, you take it to the vet, it will be tested for Giardia, as it's very common to pick up at dog parks, and dogs like to drink from puddles and streams in the bayou. Symptoms include cramping, severe diarrhea, nausea, and literally the worst flatulence or farts you can ever smell. So let's cue the storytelling music. I used to teach a class called Pathogenic Microbiology, where I would teach people all the microorganisms that can make you sick. And one of them would be this diplomonad called Giardia. And when I was teaching the course, I had a student who was a outdoor nature guide. He worked in Colorado, and he would take people camping. And on one of the trips, he raised his hand and he told me, "Oh my gosh, I know what Giardia is." On one of his trips, the folks on the trip had drunk from a stream. And Giardia is commonly found in the intestines of bears. So if you drink from a stream where a bear pooped in, you will get Giardia. And what he told us was that that night, the guy who got Giardia, his fart smelled so bad that he literally cleared out the campsite. So please know that Giardia causes gastrointestinal illness, cramping, severe diarrhea, nausea, and really terrible flatulence. Another diplomonad that you guys should know are trypanosomes. Trypanosomes are parasitic flagellates, which all that means is it's a flagellated protozoan, like I discussed earlier. And what happens is it causes a wave-like motion when moving around. And insects transmit trypanosomes, such as Trypanosoma cruzi. And this is a really big deal in South America because it causes the disease, Chagas disease. It's transmitted by the kissing bug, and it's a major disease in South America. I highly recommend that you watch this video. What it's going to show you is a kissing bug biting someone, and what happens when that kissing bug bites someone, it's going to defecate or poop on that person, and us dumb humans, we scratch the poop into the wound, and that's how trypanosomes get in. And what they do is they literally just take over your body. It's a super cool video. I highly recommend that you watch it. Please know that trypanosomes are flagellated protozoans. They are also diplomonads, and they're the cause of Chagas disease, and they're transmitted by the kissing bug. Another flagellated protozoan are these euglenoids. These euglenoids are found throughout the bayou, and they don't make us sick. Some have chloroplasts and evolved by secondary endosymbiosis with green algae. So what that means is that green algae and euglenoids started hanging out together, and eventually those euglenoids ate the green algae, and that's what gives them some energy. They typically live in fresh water, and they have a contractile vacuole, which means that they will suck in water and expel it to help them move around. And they also have this flagella, which is like this whip-like projection that will help it move. This is a pretty awesome video of Euglena moving around. You can see that they're green because they do have chloroplasts inside them. The next protists that we're going to be talking about are mineral-shelled protozoans. So these are also protists, and you do need to know the difference between foraminiferae and radiolarians. They are both single-celled marine protists with sieve-like shells. What they do is they capture food by literally like sucking in water and pulling out all the bacteria to eat. Both are marine heterotrophs and may be part of plankton. What does that mean? That means that they are found in warm tropical waters, and plankton are a community of tiny drifting or swimming organisms, and the general term contains foraminiferae and radiolarians. So both foraminiferae and radiolarians make up plankton. So the first one we're going to talk about are foraminiferae. Foraminiferae are heterotrophic single-celled protists. That means that they prey on bacteria and smaller protists, so they can't make their own food. And they have a chalky calcium carbonate shell, which you guys can see here. And what you should know about foraminiferae, besides the fact that they have to eat other organisms to survive and they live in marine environments, is that the deposits of their remains are mined for chalk and limestone. So if you ever use chalk on the chalkboard, you are using portions of the foraminiferae shell. Radiolarians are a little bit different. They too are heterotrophic, which means that they have to eat other organisms to survive. But they have a glassy silica shell, which you guys can see here. And they are a major component of plankton in tropical waters. And they are used to make silica, which are, if you guys ever buy a good pair of shoes, they come with these silica beads, which can absorb moisture. So radiolarians have a glassy silica shell. That's what makes them different from foraminiferae. And they are found in tropical waters. The next protists we're going to discuss are the alveolates. Now, if you guys remember from the respiratory lecture, alveolar, that should help you guys understand what alveolates are. Alveolates are single-celled, and they have tiny sacs beneath the plasma membrane that help them breathe. Most dinoflagellates and ciliates are aquatic and free-living, but all apicomplexans are parasites. You're probably going, what the heck is Dr. Hollander talking about? I'll explain what a dinoflagellate and a ciliate are in a minute, as well as apicomplexans. So an alveolate is a member of the protist lineage having small sacs beneath the plasma membrane, which contain air. And the following protists are alveolates. You have the dinoflagellate, the ciliate, and apicomplexan. So if I ask on the exam, which of the following protists are alveolates, you should select dinoflagellate, ciliate, and apicomplexan. So the first ones we're going to be talking about are dinoflagellates. So like I said before, dinoflagellate is an alveolate. Dinoflagellates are whirling aquatic heterotrophs and autotrophs with cellulose plates. What other organisms contain cellulose? I hope you guys picked plants. They have photosynthetic dinoflagellates that supply reef-building corals with sugar and oxygen. And what's really cool is that some dinoflagellates bioluminesce, which I'm going to show you a picture of on the next slide. That helps them keep predators away and signals to fellow protists. Some dinoflagellates cause red tides. So please know a dinoflagellate is a single-celled aquatic protus. It has a cellulose plate. It's heterotrophic. And if I ever ask you which protists are bioluminescent, you should pick dinoflagellates on the exam. So here is a picture of dinoflagellates, and this is literally a bunch of dinoflagellates that are bioluminescing along the coast of California. And this is a super cool video that's going to show you these guys bioluminescing in tropical waters. So I highly recommend that you watch this video and see how cool these guys are. The next alveolates are called ciliates. Ciliates are aquatic predators and parasites with many cilia. So you see these tiny hair-like projections, those are cilia, and they beat them to move around. So a ciliate is a single-celled heterotrophic alveolate protist with many cilia, so they have to eat others. They are aquatic predators and they feed on bacteria, algae, and one another. For example, the paramecium, which is shown here, feeds by using cilia to sweep the food into its gullet. And this YouTube video is going to show you one ciliate eating another, which is pretty cool to watch. It's kind of terrifying, but it's pretty neat. So again, here we have our predatory ciliates. Most ciliates are aquatic predators that feed on bacteria, algae, and one another. And here you can see one ciliate eating another ciliate. And again, here's the video that shows them eating each other. Apicomplexans are also alveolates, and you need to know that apicomplexans are parasitic protists. And if you guys remember from previous lectures, a parasite is an organism that is going to feed on another organism or a host. So the apicomplexan is a single-cell parasite, and it lives part of its life inside animal cells, and its life cycle often involves more than one host species, which means that it's going to develop in different animals or insects. And an example of an apicomplexan is going to be malaria. So if you've ever heard of the disease malaria, it's actually caused by a protist. And it's called apicomplexan because it has this apical prominence on it. It doesn't look like any of the other alveolates that we discussed. So malaria is the leading cause of human death, killing more than 1.3 million people every year. And what it does is it literally causes your red blood cells to burst. And when your red blood cells burst, they release toxins into your blood. And what else do red blood cells do? They carry oxygen throughout the body. So if your red blood cells are bursting, you're not getting enough oxygen to your tissues and you're feeling pretty terrible. Malaria replicates in liver, causing liver damage. And the apicomplexan that causes malaria is called Plasmodium. So please know that apicomplexans are predatory protists, and one type of apicomplexan called Plasmodium causes malaria. And mosquitoes carry this apicomplexan called Plasmodium from one human host to another. So what happens? Well, if you live in a place where malaria is, an infected mosquito is going to bite a human. And what's going to happen is that Plasmodium, or that protist, is going to enter the blood, which is going to carry it to the liver. Once in the liver, that Plasmodium is going to reproduce asexually in the liver cells, and it's going to release itself into the blood. And then once it's in the blood, it's going to reproduce itself in red blood cells, causing those red blood cells to burst. So please know that Plasmodium is a protist, and it is an apicomplexan. That's the type of protist it is. And it is carried by mosquitoes and causes the disease malaria. All right, here's a great video that explains the life cycle of malaria. An ongoing malarial infection can lead to convulsions, coma, and eventual death. Malaria has been a potent selective force on humans in Africa because what happens is people who have sickle cell anemia are also protected against malaria because the parasite cannot invade sickle cell red blood cells. So it's pretty interesting. So if you are of African descent, you may carry sickle cell anemia or be sickle cell anemic. So key concepts. Most protist lineages are entirely single-celled. They include flagellated protozoans, shelled cells called foraminiferans and radiolarians, and alveolates, which include ciliates, dinoflagellates, and apicomplexans. The next protists we're going to talk about are called straminopiles. Straminopiles include heterotrophic water molds, single-celled diatoms, and multi-celled brown algae, and we're going to go over all three. So, a straminopile are defined mainly by genetic similarities rather than visible traits. So, all three of these organisms, the diatom, the brown algae, and the water mold, they all are related genetically to each other. So, the first straminopile we're going to discuss are water molds. Water molds are decomposers and parasites that grow as a mesh of absorptive filaments. If you guys ever own a fish tank and your fish get ick, that is considered a water mold, and here's an example. Some parasitic species are important plant pathogens. For example, a water mold is what caused the Irish potato famine. So water mold is a protist that grows as nutrient-absorbing filaments, and please know that water molds are what caused the Irish potato famine. Diatoms are silica-shelled photosynthetic cells. The shells are two parts that fit together like a shoebox, and after death, the shells fall to the ocean floor. Silica in shells is used as abrasive cleaners and insecticides. So please know that diatoms are protists, and their shells are used as abrasive cleaners and insecticides. Some cells live individually and others form chains. They are particularly abundant in cool waters. So a diatom is a single-celled photosynthetic protist. Um, they're found in damp soils, lakes, and oceans, and their shells are used for cleaners and insecticides. And this is a picture of diatoms. Brown algae, ranging in size from microscopic strands to giant kelps, contain the brown pigment, so that's why they're called brown algae. And brown algae are the source of algins used as thickeners and emulsifiers. So we use brown algae a whole bunch in ice cream, jelly beans, pudding, toothpaste, and cosmetics. So please know that brown algae is actually a protist. It's not a plant. And it's found in cooler marine waters, and we use it in our foods used as thickeners and emulsifiers. And this is a picture of brown algae. So please know brown algae is not a plant, it's a protist. So brown algae are an entirely multicellular group of protists. They are members of the same lineage as single-celled photosynthetic cells called diatoms, which we use in insecticides and cleaners, and water molds, which are what is responsible for the Irish potato famine. The next protists we're going to be discussing are red algae and green algae. So these are not plants. I repeat, these are not plants. Red algae are photosynthetic protists that deposit cellulose in cell walls, store sugars as starch, and has a chloroplast containing chlorophyll A and the red pigment called phycobilins. I expect you to know that red algae have the pigment phycobilins. So it sounds like a plant, but red algae is actually a protist. And then green algae is photosynthetic protist that deposits cellulose in cell walls, stores sugars as starch, and has chloroplast containing